And so last week was kind of a wordy study. We read quite a bit. I'm not going to read as much, but we are going to focus on the first 2 and possibly 3 judges of the Israelites. We talked about 2 weeks ago in our introductory material to the book of Judges that this takes place after Moses has failed to go into the promised land. Joshua takes his place, leads the Israelites into the land of promise. Joshua dies. The elders oversee the people of Israel for a few years, and then the elders die off, and then everybody kind of becomes fragmented to their tribes. There's no leadership from the elders anymore. There's no real leadership in the tribes themselves. And you see the Israelites go into disarray. They start worshiping false gods. They start adopting Canaanite spouses and Canaanite religions and all types of things. And here the Bible tells us that in the Judges, everyone did what was, go ahead and finish that for me. Right in his own eyes, right? And we talked about in our introduction material that could pretty much sum down the problem with modern day Christianity. Everyone does what is right in his own eyes. And so their demise is probably the demise of a lot of people today who call themselves Christians. And so we probably relate to these individuals a lot closer than we would like to by looking at them. And so in the lesson 2, looking at chapter 3, verses 7 through 31, we're going to be looking at how God delivers these individuals, these Israelites, because they decide, you know what, maybe what we're doing isn't the best way. Maybe we should go back to God, and maybe He'll be able to deliver us from our oppression. And so let's go ahead and start there. If you want to, let's go back and let's read verses 11 through 15 of chapter 1, because here we're introduced to our very first judge in chapter 1, verses 11 through 15. From there they went against the inhabitants of Debir. The name of Debir formerly was Kiriath-Sepher. And Caleb said, "He who attacks Kiriath-Sepher and captures it, I will give him Achsah, my daughter, for a wife." And Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, captured it. And he gave him Achsah, the daughter, for his wife. And when she came to him, she urged him to ask for her father a field. And she dismounted from her donkey. And Caleb said to her, "What do you want?" And she said, "Give me a blessing. Since you have set me in the land of the Negeb, give to me the springs of water." And Caleb gave her the upper and the lower springs. Now this is mentioned also in Joshua chapter 15, verses 15 through 19. And so we know from the book of Joshua, it's almost verbatim what we read here in verses 11 through 15, that this actually took place back when Joshua was alive. And so Othniel is an individual who is like Caleb. Somebody give me a rundown on Caleb. Somebody tell me who Caleb was and why he's impressive. All right, there were spies that were sent out to the land of Israel. That was back in the time of Moses, right? And he sends out spies, and all the spies come back and say, "We can't take the land," right? Except 2, right? Joshua and Caleb. And because of their faithfulness and their faith in God, Joshua becomes the leader of the Israelites, and Caleb is given a portion of land for him and his family. Well, we know that Othniel is Caleb's brother. Some say maybe he was Caleb's nephew. We don't really know, but probably his brother. And so this individual was a warrior just like his brother Caleb. You know, he's just from a warrior, a fighting family. And so Othniel rises up. He takes the city of Debir, which becomes an important city in the rest of the Old Testament. And so Othniel is given that land for himself, and he is given Caleb's daughter in marriage, which would make that his what? His niece or his cousin, depending on if he's Caleb's brother or if he's his nephew, depending on who you read. And so either way, you know, we would say it's not kosher, right? And so, but from Adams, right? Right? Or from Paytonsville, either one, you know. So, probably Alabama fans, probably, you know what I'm talking about. yeah. Half the congregation just amen, the other half is looking for remove membership. But anyways, and so here we have this incident that talks about this happened during the time of Joshua. And so chapter 1 and chapter 2 of Judges is interesting because it kind of goes back and forth to what takes place during the life of Joshua and after Joshua is deceased. But here we can tell that this happened during the time frame of Joshua. And so since Othniel is alive during Joshua's reign, we know the elders ruled ruled after the death of Joshua, and Othniel is the first judge, there's not a whole lot of gap between the death of Joshua and the apostasy of the Israelites. We would like to think there's been some time, a pretty good sized gap, that the elders ruled and the people had time to kind of, wander away, and it doesn't really seem that took place. It seemed like it was pretty abrupt. They left God pretty quickly. So here we're introduced in chapter 1 to our judge. So let's go back to chapter 3 now. And let's look at verses 7 through 11 of chapter 3 and learn a little bit more about our first judge. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And they forgot the Lord, their God, and served Baals and the Asherah. And therefore the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he sowed them in the land of Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia. And the people of Israel served Cushan-Rishathaim 8 years. And when the people of Israel cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer or a judge for the people of Israel who saved them. Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. The Spirit of the Lord was upon him, and he judged Israel. And he went out to war, and the Lord gave Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, into his hand, and his hand prevailed over the king. So the land had rest 40 years, and Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died. And so here you can see on this map, and if you can't see that, I apologize. But if you can see at the very top, right there by the tribe of Manasseh, you have an indication of the letter 1, the number 1, and there you see Mesopotamia. Now, does anybody know where Deber is? Where Othniel is coming from? We haven't discussed it in detail. Okay, do you guys kind of see at the very bottom, you see the tribe of Judah? That's that gray, that really big gray spot in the bottom right there. And then you kind of see the tribe right there that's kind of encapsulated around Judah. Do y'all see that? Okay, that's where Othniel is from. And so many archaeologists and commentators believe that the very first oppression that was done by the Mesopotamian king was the most severe oppression, because this is the only time where you have the oppressor and the judge on the exact opposite ends of the nation of Israel. And so here you have the oppressor coming out of Mesopotamia, which is in the far northeast. And here you have the judge, Othniel, coming from the very southwest. And so many believe that this was indication of the fact that this king controlled pretty much all of Israel, and that he had pretty much taken over the entire tribe of Israel, which no other foreign powers do in its entirety the rest of time. And so many people have surmised that maybe the judges decrease in power as they go along. The last judge, of course, is Samson. So Othniel is the best judge. He's the purest judge. He's the most moral judge. He's the brother of Joshua. He's probably been faithful the entire time. And then you get to the end, you got Samson. And Samson's a punk. I mean, he's a drunk, he's a womanizer, he's unfaithful, he's a liar, he's just a bad guy. I mean, to be a judge, he's a really bad person. Not somebody that you want to, marry your daughter to. And so you have this stark contrast from the beginning of Judges and the end of Judges. The judges seem to get weaker, and but also the oppression seems to be not as widespread as the further you go along. Yes, Brother Austin. Yeah, some translations call them deliverers or executors, maybe. And so the idea is that they're not giving justice like a judge would, but they're executing God's justice or God's judgment, if you will. They're not giving a judgment themselves. Oftentimes we think of a judge, right? You go before the judge, and he's the one who decides what's going to happen. He interprets the law, and he gives forth the decree, innocent, guilty. If you're guilty, what's that punishment going to look like? He makes that decision himself. Whereas the judges of the Old Testament were more like executors, where God has given his judgment on these foreign powers, and they're the ones who rise up to carry out that judgment. And so sometimes if we let our 21st century understanding of judge understand, like if we see, Samson as being kind of like this judge that people go to for wisdom and insight, that's not really what takes place in the judges. So great question. And so here we, yes. Not much, because we know Othniel was alive during the lifetime of Joshua, because he takes the land of Deber while Joshua is still in command of the army and command of the people in Joshua 15. And then Othniel is our very first judge at about 1350. And so not much. We're not sure. Probably definitely less than 50 years, maybe less than 25 years.
And how much time between the time the last judge ruled and Saul came into power?
Yeah, there's about a 400-year time frame between the time frame of the first judge and the last judge. After the last judge, we've probably got about another 25 years before we see Saul come to power. Because when the very last judge is in play, Samuel was already alive, and Elijah and Samuel. And so we've already got Elijah and Samuel alive during the time of the judges. And so at the time of the last judge to the time of the first monarch, that would be Saul, it's not that long. It's less than one generation. Great question. Great question.
Caleb was his other brother, right?
Yeah, Caleb was his brother. And so, well, Joshua wasn't his brother, but he was alive during the time of Joshua, and Caleb was his brother. Great. Any other questions or comments? All right, so this takes place in about 1358 to about 1350 BC, and so almost 1400 years before the birth of Christ. And so that would be like us talking about the Visigoths sacking Rome in like the 500s. I mean, so there's a huge time frame between this and Christ, just like in between us and the 600s. And so it's interesting to see just the span of time that takes place. And so you have Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Syria and northern Iraq. And the people cried out to God, and he heard them. And so Othniel, he rises up an army. He goes and he crushes the king of Mesopotamia. And what you do is, you don't have to watch modern-day politics, but if you have one centralized power in an area, and somebody takes out that power or that regime, what happens? What's the phrase everybody calls that? You create a power vacuum. Or chaos, the same, different term, probably the same thing, right? You create a power vacuum. And so what you have in the first judge, Othniel goes up and he takes care of this Mesopotamian king, which is probably controlling most of the area of Israel and the surrounding lands. Well, the first judge goes and takes out this king, and you create a power vacuum, which is why when we see the next judge, Ehud, you're going to see that there's several kingdoms who are starting to rise to power and take some of the land back away from the Israelites. And so Othniel was a bold warrior like his brother. He received a wife, which was his niece, for his bravery. And he appears to be the greatest, it appears to be the greatest oppression that the Israelites suffered under the judges, because it appears like the Mesopotamian army is control of all of Israel. They may not be, but it seems to be the case because of the geography, and we don't see that any other time with the judges, and so it's a pretty big deal. Also, whenever you get to Samson, the last judge, the oppression by the Philistines is on one border in the southwest, and it seems not to be too terrible of an oppression. And so it seems like it gets less and less as the time progresses before we get to the time of the monarch Saul, and of course David, who eventually wipes out the Philistines. And so many have guessed or have said that Othniel was possibly the greatest judge. The Bible doesn't say that, but they look at the scope of the oppression, and they look at just how far Othniel had to go to put down this Mesopotamian king. And so they say perhaps Othniel was the greatest judge there was. We don't know, but after Othniel, how many years of peace do they experience?
40 years.
40 years. So not bad. Not bad. They go from being oppressed to having peace for 40 years. And so here on this map, you can see Othniel's campaign. And so in the very north, you have the region of Mesopotamia. And so Othniel is down in the southwest in the tribe of Judah. And he takes his troops, his army, and he goes up all the way to the north. He crushes the king, and then he frees the land of this oppression. And so you can see just how far he had to go to set his people free. And so a pretty good distance. If I'm not mistaken, I believe it's the distance from like Memphis to Knoxville is roughly the size of like southern Israel to northern Israel. And so here you can kind of see on foot that takes, it's a lot harder than going on I-40, right? And so this is the tomb of Othniel. If you ever go to the Bible lands, you can actually go to the tomb where he and his family supposedly were buried. And you say, Isaac, how do we know that? That's his tomb. We don't. It's just, they say it is, and so maybe it is, maybe it's not. But you can kind of see an ancient tomb of what it might be for someone living in this time frame. And so oftentimes what they would do is they would go and they would set the dead bodies here in the tombs. They would lay them out kind of on those stones. You could walk in there, and after about a year or so, after the decomposing process, they would take the bones and put them in a small wooden box called an ossuary, and then they would put those into the hewn out holes in the tomb. So oftentimes you would have a tomb for a family. And so, any questions on Othniel before we go on to our second judge?
Is there any significance in verse 10 which says the Spirit of the Lord came upon him? I haven't seen that with the other judges as much.
Yeah, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. This is a phrase that's used in other places, like in Numbers 24 for Moses. It's also mentioned in Judges chapter 11, 29. It's mentioned in 1 Samuel 19, 20, and 2 Chronicles 20, 14. And so it occurs in the Old Testament, but not very often. And so it only occurs one other time with a judge. And so many have asked, what does this mean? Is this a supernatural Spirit event? I mean, is this like, David, in the Psalms, take not your Holy Spirit from me? What does this mean? And there's nothing in the text that really tells us what it means. Whether or not that he was just, if the Lord gave him some sort of supernatural, like Samson. Samson was a Nazirite, and so he was able to have immaculate strength because of the vow his mother that gave when she was pregnant. And but we just don't know. And so some have looked at this verse and said, this is evidence of God bestowing his Spirit upon Othniel. We're not told how it came out or how it was, just that it was with him. And some say, no, the Lord was just with him during this campaign. And so there's nothing really in the text that definitively tells us one way or the other which is the case. But it's a good question. We just don't have an answer. So, good question. Any other questions or comments? No? Okay. Our second judge, Ehud, or however, I think the modern Hebrew pronunciation is Ehud. Brittany said that sounded Canadian, so, that's what we'll go with, though. So let's look at verses 12 through 20. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel, because they had done what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And he gathered to himself the Ammonites and the Amalekites, and he went and defeated Israel, and they took possession of the city of palms, which is Jericho. And the people of Israel served Eglon, the king of Moab, 18 years. Then the people of Israel cried out to the Lord, and the Lord raised up for them a deliverer, Ehud, the son of Gera, a Benjamite, a left-handed man. The people of Israel sent tribute to him, to Eglon, the king of Moab. And Ehud made for himself a sword with two edges, a cubit in length, and he bound it on his right thigh under his clothes. And he presented tribute to Eglon, king of Moab. Now Eglon was a very fat man. And when Ehud had finished presenting this tribute, he sent away the people who carried the tribute. But he himself turned back at the idols near Gilgal and said, I have a secret message for you, O king. And he commanded, silence. And all of his attendants went away from his presence. And Ehud came to him as he was sitting alone in the cool roof chamber. And Ehud said, I have a message from God to you. And he arose from his seat, and Ehud reached with his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, and he thrust it into his belly. And the hilt went and the hilt went in after the blade, and the fat closed in over the blade, for he did not pull out the sword out of his belly, and dung came out. Then Ehud went out of the porch and closed the doors of the roof of the chamber behind him and locked it. And when he had gone, the servants came, and when they saw the doors of the roof chamber were locked, they thought, surely he is relieving himself in the closet of the cool chamber. And they waited till they were embarrassed. But when he still had not opened the doors of the roof chamber, they took the key and opened it, and there lay their lord dead on the floor. And Ehud escaped without they delayed, and he passed beyond the idols and escaped to Sirah. And when he arrived, he sounded the trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim, and the people of Israel went down with him from the hill country, and he was their leader. And he said to them, "Follow after me, for the Lord has given your enemies, the Moabites, into your hand." So they went then after him and seized the lords of the Jordan against the Moabites, and did not allow anyone to pass over. And they killed at that time 10,000 of the Moabites, all strong, able-bodied men, and not one man escaped. So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land had rest for 80 years. And so here we have Ehud. And Ehud is a Benjamite. And the Benjamites are known to be warriors. The name, I forgot to do this with Othniel. The name for Othniel means Lion of God or God's strength. Ehud means where is the majesty. And so Ehud comes about a time where Eglon, which means fat ox. Literally, I mean, Eglon is 2 words in Hebrew, which means just fat ox. And so you've got this Eglon, this Moabite figure who's a super fat king, and he's oppressing the people of Israel, and they pay tribute because in the ancient world that's what oppression looks like. You've got to pay your taxes, right? You know, that's kind of the same thing today, right? What does oppression look like? You got everybody, taxation is theft, right? The little flags or stuff you see on Facebook. And so he goes and he presents tribute. And so evidently Ehud is someone who is a leader within the people of Benjamin, because he goes and he presents tribute to the king. This would have been an annual thing that is done each and every year when you are a conquered people. And so when he goes to Eglon, Eglon knows who this guy is, or seems not to be put off by him. And so it seems that Ehud was somebody of of substance within the tribe of Benjamin who was bringing this tribute to Eglon, the overseeing king. The Moabites and the Ammonites were not only neighbors, but they were also descendants of Abraham. In fact, or of Abraham's family. The Moabites and the Ammonites were the ancestors of Lot, or the descendants of Lot. Lot was their ancestor. And the Amalekites were the descendants of Esau on Israel's southern border. And so here you have the Moabites, the Ammonites, and the Amalekites, who were all related to the Israelites. And so some time has passed since the people have taken the land. And one of the places they took was a walled city by the name of Jericho, right? And Jericho means the city of palms. And so they take Jericho. It's one of the most well-known fights under the time of Joshua, because they walk around the walled city, the walls cave going on the inside, and they destroy everybody. And so it's a massive victory. But now fast forward, Joshua's dead, and the people have been unfaithful. And now these 3 individuals have kind of retaken Jericho and rebuilt it themselves. And so here you have these foreign people living inside the territory that God gave the Israelites. And so they're oppressed by the Moabite king, Eglon, which means fat ox. These people who are oppressing them are the descendants of Lot, Esau. It is interesting when you get the minor prophets. Who do the minor prophets speak out against? They say destruction is coming from the Lord. And who are they addressing? Anybody know? There's one obvious guess. That's correct. The Israelites, right? I mean, it's the Old Testament, right? So obviously the Israelites. But that's not the only people that the minor prophets issue warnings to. They issue warnings to these individuals, the Moabites and the Ammonites, because they are descendants of Lot. They're descendants of Esau. I mean, these are individuals who should have known who Yahweh was. I mean, their forefathers, they knew who Yahweh was. They served Yahweh. They sacrificed Yahweh. And so the minor prophets Amos addresses, like 95% of Amos is addressed to foreign nations around Israel, not just Israel. And he says, look, destruction is coming on you guys too, because you should have known better. And he's talking to individuals whose ancestors worshiped Yahweh hundreds, if not 1,000 years before. And he says, it doesn't matter. You should have known better. Destruction is coming upon you. And the Lord says one of the reasons why his anger kindled against these foreign nations is because they should have been helping their cousins, if you will, instead of trying to oppress them. And so Ehud was a left-handed man. Any left-handed people in here? Any left-handers? Right? Did y'all know statistically, like y'all live like 3 years less than right-handed people? Did y'all know that? No? Yeah, it's like, why do we like you? I don't know who makes up these statistics, but supposedly left-handed people live like 2 to 3 years less than right-handed people. I don't know if because they use like right-handed toothbrushes with their left hand or what. I don't know how that works, but I did see that on Facebook, which means it's probably not true. Well, if you're ambidextrous, I think that adds 3 years to your life. So, the Benjamites were known to be left-handed. In fact, later on when the Benjamites fight, they're feared warriors because they fight with their left hand. It's like baseball. You know, everybody's right-handed. So you have a left-handed pitcher, everybody wants them because it's different. It's hard. You're used to seeing the ball come out from a right-handed side. You've got 0.3 milliseconds to make a reaction. You put it in the left hand, it's harder to track. If you're used to fighting somebody with a sword in hand-to-hand combat with their right hand, and all of a sudden the sword is coming from the opposite direction, it makes it difficult because you have milliseconds to react. And there are no strikeouts in ancient warfare, right? There's just really sharp pieces of metal going in your flesh. And so the Benjamites were known to be dangerous fighters because they were left-handed. Now, people have asked, was it hereditary? Because left-handedness is actually hereditary. Or did they take these young men and make them train with their left hand so they would have an army of left-handed soldiers? The answer is, we don't know because the Bible doesn't tell us. But it is interesting, you have so many warriors from the tribe of Benjamin who were left-handed. And of course, Ehud is a left-handed soldier. And so he takes the dagger, he fashions it to his right-handed thigh. And so that way when he goes into the upper chamber here with Eglon, he is able to take the dagger out and able to stab him. And so this brings about 80 years of peace. And here on this map that you can see, you have Eglon, who is the chief king. And so he's the Moabites. And so here you can see from the north he takes the Ammonites, and from the south he takes the Amalekites. And those three red lines show the convergence of they're in Jericho. So Eglon is in Jericho. He has a palace in Jericho. He has an army of Moabites and also Amalekites and Ammonites who are with him in Jericho. And here you have the tribe of Benjamin that you can see right there. And Jericho is located where the tribe of Benjamin, where their land was going to be. And so Ehud the Benjamite goes and he offers this tribute. And so this would have been a palace or a house in ancient Israel. And so here you can see here they're multi-level, just like in the days of Jesus. Still in Palestine today, most of the time, the tops of these houses are flat. You can go on top of them because it's a little bit cooler. There's a breeze. It's not as hot. And so he goes up to the upper chamber. Now he was probably in a closed off section, maybe that second tier, because the wind can come through because you've got other houses that are lower. And so Ehud goes up to the second tier, most likely, where the chamber is, where it's a little bit cooler, where they've probably got a chamber pot where Eglon normally uses the bathroom. And so Ehud goes up in there and he stabs him with a dagger. And this is a dagger from the Bronze Age. So this is what it would have looked like. And this is a cubit long. Some translations say a short cubit. How long is a cubit? 18 inches, right? And you've all heard sermons before in Sunday school classes. How can you measure a cubit? Right? From your elbow to the tip of your fingers, right? And so everybody was the same ethnicity, so everybody was about the same height. Like, you don't have the problem of today of like, if you take a cubit on my arm and a cubit on Cord's arm, like, they're vastly different. You know, like this way, like, how could this be uniform? You know, but if you're at the same nation, everybody's got the same, great granddad, and everybody's about the same height. And so here you've got this dagger, but as you can see, there's no hilt. And so a lot of times on swords and daggers, you'll see a hilt, which is a piece of metal that kind of fans out, so it kind of stops when you hit the flesh, so it doesn't go all the way in where you can't retrieve it. This is a dagger that was probably the one that Ehud, not the one, but like the one Ehud would have used. And so you can see how if you just keep on pressing, there's nothing to stop that blade from going in further. And so he sticks it in him, it goes all the way in, it comes out the other side, and his bowels basically start leaking. And imagine what that would be like. I mean, here's this king who's a foreign oppressor. He's fat. My friend from Germany, he saw me, and we were talking on the cell phone. He'd been gone for about a year, and he said, "Do you have a?" And he paused for a second, and he was thinking. He said, "In Germany we call it," and he said whatever it was in German, and he was trying to translate it in his mind. He was like, "A wealth belly yet?" I said, "A what?" He said, "Germany we call it a wealth belly, like, it's an idea, right? It's like that ancient idea where, if you got enough food, you ain't starving to death, so you must be doing pretty good." And I was like, I don't think I've got a wealth belly yet, But anyways, so Eglon here is super fat, right? Which in the ancient world's not a bad thing. It means you're rich, you're wealthy, you're not doing manual labor. You got guys for that. right? You call a guy if something breaks. You call a guy to tend your fields. You call a guy to make your food. And so here you have this guy who's just wealthy and has whatever he wants, and now he's lying dying in a pool of his own excrement. I mean, talk about being humbled by God, right? And it's interesting. And the Bible has irony, right? Oftentimes we miss ironic statements in the Bible. How do you think it smelled? Why don't the servants go in to check on Eglon? The door is locked and they think something else. I think he's using the bathroom. Why do you think they think he's using the bathroom? Maybe because it smelled like it.
How would you pick up the name Ehud? If it means fat ox, that's not a name you give to a baby. And you don't think that that's a name that they give, start calling the king.
Yeah. Well, it's a good thing. Is Eglon a name that the Israelites called him, and that's they're known him by? Is that a name? You know, in the ancient world, you know, when somebody calls us fat, you're like, hey, well, watch out there, buddy. You know, you're no string bean yourself. You know what I mean? But in the ancient world, it had been almost like, yeah, you know, it's almost like a, you know, they didn't have, you know, today if we want to show somebody we're wealthy, we have 6,000 square foot house, Rolex watch, and a decked out, you know, 6-figure car. You know, back then, you know, you had a belly, you know, and so maybe he may have embraced the idea of being a.
Your point, I said, it's still like that today. Like, hey, I went on a mission trip many years ago.
Oh yeah.
And there was a guy that was, believe it or not, he was twice my size. And when we go out to the churches, I mean, he drew people not in church. Crowds from the village would come out, and the women all followed that guy everywhere he went. And the missionary there explained this, and they think he's probably a king from the USA, you know.
Yeah.
The guy.
Yeah.
He said 10, 15 years later, they still talked about that guy every time he went out to those churches and stuff.
Yeah. But if you couldn't hear Rob, he was talking about anybody not hear Rob right then? Everybody heard him? You're better than me, Rob.
Rob's just upset that we're talking about him.
Yeah. You picked the wrong trip to go on, Rob.
I'm going back to Tommy.
Yeah. Take Tommy back. They'll look at Tommy and think, man, times are tough in the U.S., right? No, but yeah, I mean, just goes what you're saying, right? It's a different mindset, you know, and so that's what they would have thought back then. Like, you know, this guy's important. You know, he's you can tell he doesn't have to work, you know, and we think of that negatively now, but back when you had to, you know, work or starve, it was kind of a nice thing to have. And so here you can kind of see, this is maybe hard to see, but here you have Jericho. And so here you see the trick that Ehud took to get to Jericho. He's in Jericho. He flees. He goes north to Shirah, and he calls the army there. They run down. They actually beat the Moabites to the Jordan River. And so it's very hard to cross the river. And so they take the best place to cross. They know the Moabites are going to try to rush too. And when the Moabites finally realize that Eglon is dead, they get their army ready to go back across to friendly territory. Because when the king dies, everybody, you know, just what are we going to do? When they get there, the Israelites are already waiting for them, ready to fight. And so the Israelites kill 10,000 men after killing Eglon. And so here we have Shamgar. I said before we're going to reach 2 judges, maybe a third. That was not because I was afraid of timing, which I probably should have been, but it's because we don't know if Shamgar was a judge or not. Sometimes he's listed as a judge, sometimes he's not. Let's figure out why it's hard to determine. Let's read verse 31. After him was Shamgar, the son of Anath, who killed 600 of the Philistines with an ox goad, and he also saved Israel. The reason why this is interesting is because is he an Israelite? Because his name is not an Israelite name. Every Hebrew word has 3 letters. It's a very easy language. On a scale from 1 to 10, to learn a language, English is like a 9. Mandarin Chinese is like a 9 or 10. Ancient Greek is like 6. Ancient Hebrew is like a 2. It looks, when you look at it, your mind is blown because it looks so different. But it is such a basic and simple language. And because it's so basic and because it's so simple, when there's a difference, it's easy to catch, right? And so Shamgar is not an Israelite name. More than that, the son of Anath, Anath is a foreign god. And so is his dad named after a foreign god, a Canaanite god, or is Shamgar Is he a foreign god worshiper? We don't know. And so was he a judge? The Bible doesn't say he was a judge. In fact, he's one of the only ones mentioned in the Bible that it doesn't say, and God raised up a judge. In fact, you don't have how many years of the oppression. You don't have it's the Philistines, but there's no details to it. It's so small. He doesn't have an Israelite name, and it doesn't say that God raised him up. So it's really weird. It's only a verse long. And then we get back to verse 1 of chapter 4, and we're going right back to Ehud again. And so it's interesting, was this guy a judge or not? And so, interesting note, the Bible does not say that God raised him up. Maybe the fact that he didn't like the Philistines, and he kind of helped to keep the Philistines at bay, and so he helped Israel. We don't know, but he was a great warrior regardless of who he was, where he was, if he was an Israelite, if he was half an Israelite, maybe you've got something like, Timothy. Timothy's a half Greek, he's a half Roman. I'm sorry, he's a half Roman, he's a half Jew. What's going on here? And so we don't know much about Shamgar, but what we do know is that there's 4 chapters, I believe, dedicated to Samson, and there's 1 verse dedicated to Shamgar. And Shamgar was better than Samson. Because in 4 chapters of Samson, it never says that Samson saved Israel. And in 1 verse of Shamgar, it says he saved Israel also. So it's kind of interesting when you look at it that way. Here's an ox goad. And so here you have this piece of wood. At the end, you're going to have a piece of metal. The straight edge is to poke the ox to keep them going. And the curved edge is to scrape the plow when the mud gets caked on there. And so he kills 600 Israelites with a weapon kind of like this. Pretty impressive. And so what are some things to remember from our class tonight? Number 1, there were 2 judges and a foreigner, the first 3 that we encountered. Number 2, the enemies were no match for God. When the people finally decided we're going to get back on God's team, didn't matter if there were 10,000 soldiers or who it was, they were no match for God. God wants his people to have peace. God doesn't want us to suffer. He doesn't want us to have bad lives. He doesn't want us to wallow in the pit of sin. He wants us to have peace. And the people could choose deliverance or punishment, depending on their relationship with God. Our takeaways for our 21st century lives, number 1 is we all have different backgrounds. You've got a Benjamite, you've got a guy whose tribe's not named, but he's kind of around the Judean territory. So we've got a Benjamite, possibly a Judean, and maybe even a non-Israelite at all. And so you look around the room, we have different backgrounds, different occupations, different sides of the tracks we live on, different incomes. Our kids look different. Our kids play different sports. Some of us don't even have kids. I mean, we're so different, and yet God can use each and every one of us to accomplish his will and his purposes. Secondly, our enemies are no match for God. Number 3, God wants us to have peace in our life, and we can choose if we're going to have deliverance from God or punishment from God, depending on our relationship with him and how we live. Any questions or comments before we close class tonight?
How come were there priests and stuff back then at the judge's time?
There was already a tribe of Levi. We know that the tabernacle was up in Shiloh, and so that's
How come they couldn't, well, I know, but how come they couldn't kind of keep the peace going or keep the people in order and just
yeah.
all
Yeah. Well, I don't know. It's kind of like, it's hard to say because they were up in Shiloh. The Levites didn't have any territory. They weren't fighters. And so it's kind of hard to keep a nation in line. It's kind of like asking why don't the religious preachers in America keep everybody on the straight and narrow. It's like, well, it's kind of, if people are determined to sin and be bad people, it's kind of hard to pull them from the fray. And we don't know how dedicated the Levites were this time. And so we know that the tabernacle was still in Shiloh. They were still giving sacrifices. The people were still going to the tabernacle and giving sacrifices for the Levites. And so the Levites may have just been accepting the meat offerings and the grain offerings, which they ate. And they may not have said anything about the idolatry that was going on. Not to make anybody upset. We don't really know. It's a good question, though. Any other questions or comments? No? All right. Well, thank you for your attendance and looking forward to our study next week. We're going to get into talking about Deborah and Barak. And so we'll see you again next week. And let's go ahead and close with a prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for your word and so thankful for the example of the judges. Dear Heavenly Father, please help us to realize that we can be delivered by your hand or be punished by your hand. Help us to have a relationship with you that regardless of what might take place in this life from the hands of others, whether it be men or Satan, that we can look forward to a day of deliverance through your Son. And we're so thankful for the opportunity that we've had to come together this midweek Bible study to study your word and grow closer to you and closer to each other. And help us to be shining lights in this community to let other people know that whatever they're dealing with in their life is no match for you and your power and the power that we have through your Son. It's in His name we pray. Amen.